Hello and welcome to episode 44 of React Native Radio. Today on our panel we have Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey everybody.
Ali Najafizadeh.
Hello guys.
Kevin Old.
Hello.
And our special guest today is Aaron Hasser.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for coming on. So as far as your work at DiviPay and your iOS work, can you kind of talk about what you've been doing as a native developer during your career as a native developer? What kind of apps you've been building and what you like about native development?
So most of my work at the agency was for the front end for a CMS, a sales CMS, just doing a lot of core data work and just sort of building a front end that displayed that data and then allowed you to change it in a relatively easy way. And then when I worked at Sencha, so Sencha's bread and butter is EXT. I'm sure some of you guys have actually even worked in that. But they wanted to build a native container for their mobile web apps that allowed you to do secure deployment and data and device management and all that good stuff. So I was part of the team that built this native container. It's kind of like Cordova in a sense. We had all the connections to all the fun device capabilities like the camera and the accelerometer and all that good jazz, plus some secure database and secure file system and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of what I was doing on the native side. I ended up sticking with mobile development mostly because the product of it is right there in front of you, right? So you're like touching the thing that you made as soon as you made it. And that's always been kind of the draw for me is like I get to look at and play with my software right then and there.
Yeah. So, Aaron, what exactly do you do at DiviPay?
Well, I'm their lead mobile developer, and so basically, what DiviPay is doing is we're building a system for tracking business expenses. But unlike, say, Concur, Expensify, which you might have used before, which are perfectly good products, the whole idea behind Divi is that we're going to have an actual card in your Apple wallet or your Android wallet that allow you to automatically, so you go to the grocery store, you buy some food while you're on a business trip, or you're at the gas station or whatever, and you're paying business expenses. You can do it via your phone, and it's all automatic, and there's no receipt picture taking or expense report making or anything. It all gets reported back right away. So this is kind of like there's a couple other kind of back-end systems to it, trying to make it easier for businesses to manage expenses, to limit the amount that are put on these cards and allow them to track spending almost in real time. So that's kind of sort of like if you took Concur and Expensify and put them both together and then added the wallet, that's kind of what we're aiming at. So my job is basically leading the mobile development there. And we hired a guy who had some iOS experience, but for the most part, I'm the only one who's done any mobile experience. But we've been able to get some really solid React folks up and running on mobile, which is fun.
Awesome. So DiviPay, is that something that a small business could use? Like, say I have a consultancy with a couple people. Would DiviPay work for like a small business, or are you mostly tailored to like medium and large size businesses?
So we're still working on getting our product out, but the hope is that we, without too much trouble, service big corporations and small. So my own personal consultancy, I'm going to be dogfooding it as soon as we have a system that works from the money transferring bank accounts all the way down.
Cool. So you mentioned that you had a few React developers jump on board. Is there any React Native in mind? As like the lead mobile engineer, how do you feel about like using it in a production system this day and age?
So that seems to be the question that people are asking. I actually convinced Divi to go with React Native in my interview, kind of because I've been very impressed with it. As part of my work at Sencha I did, which is how I got into React Native, did a lot of benchmarking of different kinds of, pure native versus React Native versus, React running in Cordova versus EXT running in Cordova and on all this stuff. And we actually, took real measurements. And React Native is never quite as good as pure native. It's never going to be, but it's very, very close, and it's just impressive. So combine that with the speed of development on React Native versus a normal or a pure native is just together. They just make a very good case, especially for a company like Divi, which is trying to get to market very, very quickly on both Android and iOS. Having to develop two separate code bases was just going to be impossible, even if we could get the developers. And it's, here on the Wasatch Front, it's almost impossible to get anyone with a good chunk of mobile experience. They just aren't here. So it just made a lot of sense for Divi to go with React Native. We just released our alpha. I haven't seen anything yet that's kind of making me nervous about putting in a production environment. So I know I feel pretty good about it. We'll see what I'm saying in 6 months, but I'm very, very optimistic.
So how many engineers do you guys have working on this team at the same time?
I think we're up to 10 now, 10 or 11, pretty much back-end only guys. We're working on a back-end in Elixir, which is also a new technology, is my understanding. And I guess we've got 4 or 5 front-end only guys. So, and then a couple full stack folks.
So out of curiosity, why did you guys go with Elixir?
You'd have to ask the Elixir guys. I don't have a ton of experience with the backend. My understanding is that they chose it because it had very, very good benchmarks, especially on scaling to large numbers of users and simultaneous connections.
Yeah, I've heard nothing but good things about it lately, and I've been messing around with Phoenix a little bit, so I haven't really met anyone or actually talked to anyone yet that's using it in production, but I know a lot of companies are, so that's pretty cool that you guys are using it. So I'm kind of curious, what are the main things that you like about React Native? You said that when you went to that new company, you kind of consulted with them and kind of recommended that they choose React Native. And I know you kind of gave a brief, overview of that, but what are the things in particular that you really do like about React Native? But also, what are the things that you don't like about React Native?
Yeah, so I remember when I started on doing React Native development, coming to Native, and they're like, we're just going to do this React Native thing. And I was like, okay. So this was when I was still at Sencha, and I banged my head on the wall for about a week because no one bothered to explain to me why this was compelling at all. And I'd never written a production line of JavaScript in my life. So it was like, what's going on? And then it clicked. And so the two things that and then I fell in love with it. The two things that kind of got me there was, what clicked was the UI as a function of state, the React paradigm, right? Like this idea that, okay, you have a declarative UI and it automatically does its React magic. And, when you change the data, it changes the UI. And this is it's like one of those, for me, it was one of those things when you discover a new paradigm in programming and it's just you just kind of awaken to its power. And it's felt like that when I first started doing functional programming, right? I was like, wow, this is really cool. And it's so expressive. And it just sort of makes all this set of problems that much easier. It's like I can write the code the way I think about the code, right? So, and this was another moment. It was like, wow, this solves so many problems in mobile development. Like changing the UI is it's a pain in native. And there's some solutions that have kind of are coming along to make that easier. But then you have this React solution. It was like, this is the new thing that's coming along. Kind of think that maybe not React itself, but the idea of UI as a function of state. I think that's where we're going, and you'll eventually see that come into the pure native. Well, almost 95% sure that's kind of where things will head. So that was the first thing that made me really, really like it. And then the second thing is the speed of development. So when you do pure native, you have to recompile every time you make a change. And it's gotten slightly better recently. They've gotten better at injecting new code rather than recompiling everything. but you can sit there for for 30 seconds, a minute and a half, and it's not going to seem like a long time, but it's just enough time to let yourself get distracted, right? And then you've lost 10 minutes instead of a minute and a half. But with React, you see it almost instantaneously, and that speeds things up like mad. And suddenly you're developing things in days that took you weeks and weeks that took you months, and it's just joy inducing, I guess, for lack of a better term. It's just the very speed of this. So, and then the fact on top of that, you have a really, you don't have like another write once, run everywhere solution. You have a framework that's running, with native views, that's using a lot of the native, touch handling, that's not running in a web view. So you don't have the limitations of that. And you have something that feels very native, and that's so you have this great development process, and then the end product is actually quite good as well.
So what's your take on the quality of React Native components that ship with React Native based on native components that you've worked with?
When the React guys actually like scan a native component with a React, with the React, I guess, layer, like with the various like tab views, I think is the one that I've used the most, that definitely links to a very peculiar component underneath. I think they do a really good job of abstracting that in a way that makes sense. I found in actually my development, in my consulting, and then also at Divi, that we've tended toward using JavaScript based components rather than jumping down into the native too often. Partly at Divi, we're trying to keep one code base. So we're trying to keep Android and iOS as similar as we can, just for speed's sake, and makes our designers' life easier actually as well. So I don't know that I necessarily have enough really good comparisons to answer that question fully. Some annoying things like there's no button class in React Native, and the touchables they have their own quirks, I guess is the right word, which is sometimes frustrating when you're used to working with the idea of a button.
I think they are adding a button component to a release that's coming in the next couple of months, I think. So you'll be able to import a button just like you importing a touchable highlight directly from React Native. So yeah, that is coming. But yeah,
yeah, I think one of the things that was sort of, when we were doing all these benchmarks, we were messing with the list view, and I don't know what it's like on the web, but on mobile, the list view is a benchmark for the performance of an app, just because it's really easy to tell when you're not doing a list view correctly. So like the jank shows up really easily if you're not recycling your rows correctly, or you're doing too much work inside your rendering functions or whatever. So me and the other native guy on at Sencha, we're looking at this list view, and they're like, we're super curious how it's backed, because the way that the Android list view, recycler view, and the iOS table view / I think they're calling it collection view now, the way they work is different enough. We didn't see how you could just build this one abstraction over it. It just didn't make sense to us. So we're like, how is it working underneath? And I don't know if you guys have looked at it, but it's all pretty much JavaScript. It's just a scroll view. They use a native scroll view, and then on top of it, they're doing all of that work in JavaScript for the most part. It's not backed by a collection view or a recycler view. It's backed by JavaScript. And the guy I was working with, a coworker, is like, this can't work. This can't possibly work. And like, you're sitting there watching it with your own hands, like you're flicking it up and it's working. And there's no jank. Like, it works. And that was sort of amazing that they had done this. They had actually not dropped down to these super optimized, like, probably more effort has gone into those two components by Apple and Google than probably any other in their collections. And then Facebook kind of ignored all that and did their own, and it works, which is cool.
So do you ever miss, and this is one thing that I know that it's got to have some controversy, but do you ever miss the storyboards and those kinds of visuals that you get from Xcode. Do you ever miss that?
There's nothing about Xcode that I will ever miss.
There you go.
Absolutely
Okay.
hate working with Xcode. So I kind of left the iOS world before storyboards became almost mandatory. And so before that, you get Interface Builder, and that's good. That was very good for doing some very basic prototyping. But we found out pretty quickly that we were jumping into manipulating and building and manipulating our view hierarchies in code in iOS. And I actually find that work kind of fun, doing all the calculations, and all the relative stuff, all the stuff that's done by all the what are they calling it? I forget. It's they introduced it recently. It's all the connections between instead of defining like a absolute position, you define like the connection between the various views. The term is escaping me at the moment, but it used to have to do all that stuff manually, and now they the storyboard will do that for you. On the Android side, it's always been a little bit better because they've never really absolute views were never really a thing because of the various form factors of Android devices. So you're always designing things with views relative to other views. And I never found Android quite as painful. Very rarely had to build like view hierarchies other than the standard XML templates that you use to build Android views.
Yeah, I do have one question. You're talking about the React Native. But what other type of stacks are you actually using alongside with React Native? Like the state system, I just want to know, because you as a new, or let's say as a lead developer, what type of did you start using a Redux, MobX, any other state machine, or you actually roll out your own?
Yeah, so that was it's interesting because that's like new for me, is having to make those kind of decisions. Because in the native world, you do it the way Google tells you, or Apple tells you to do it, and there's a lot less fewer decisions to be made. I pushed really, really hard originally to go with Relay as our network communications, and we ended up kind of floundering on that because the back end, because we're using Elixir and Phoenix, and then there's a plugin for Relay called Absinthe that was very, very confusing because Relay has all these extra rules beyond like the normal GraphQL spec, and so we kind of we're trying to get something out the door, so we kind of like jumped back to REST, and we ended up building our own network layer, and then it's all connected to our components via MobX. So one of the things we're working on right now is actually moving back to Relay. We hired some new talent in between then and there, and they had a little bit of experience in that realm, so they were able to kind of get us over the wall that we had faced. And so now we're moving back to Relay. So the Relay stuff that we originally got done was actually really impressive. Not having to write all this network handling code was really nice. So we'll probably end up, right now the plan is to start to replace the data stuff and then the MobX stores that we had with Relay, and then handle the internal app state with stores in MobX like we're doing now. Found MobX to be pretty good, actually, like kind of impressive coming from like the more Java, C++, Objective-C world, that there's all this kind of magic you can do with JavaScript automatically, and to kind of throw MobX in and have it more or less work in the background is neat from my perspective. There's nothing that I've ever encountered in Java or in Objective-C that would work like that.
I'm actually happy that I found somebody that used MobX in production, because we are actually using a MobX in production as well. We used to use Redux.
Yeah.
I'm not against Redux, but the amount of the boilerplate that you use, it just reduced by, let's say, 45%, 50%. So it saves us a lot. And then I actually focus, and it automatically optimizes our app as well. So I don't have to worry about should component update anymore. I automatically optimize it. Like you just basically write a normal application and then it does it for you behind the scene. And that's a big achievement for me.
So I enjoy using MobX, but I have a question. And I don't know this because I haven't used it in production. I haven't looked into it enough. I've only played around with it a couple of times. So if you have a MobX store and you connect it to a container component and you want to pass the properties down like 5 to 10 levels deep, can you access the properties at the very bottom of that hierarchy without calling observe? But can you call observe on the very top level and then have the props passed down, or do you have to observe every component that you need to extract data as props? If that makes any sense.
So do you ask me this question?
Yeah, I'm asking anybody that knows the answer.
Well, technically, the reason you actually need to use the observe is it's similar to connect with Redux, but what it does is as soon as you start using an observable variable inside the component, MobX register that component as kind of like I call it renderable, automatic renderable. So it means that as soon as you change that observable, MobX knows that it needs to render that component. So if you don't, this is kind of like the thing that at the very beginning caught me. It said, why it's not working? It should working. Maybe there's a bug in their code. But I realized that I forgot to put the observable the top of my component. So that component is just basically, as soon as you put the observable, it just basically starts listening to any changes, and it will render.
Okay, that makes sense.
So
okay,
that's yeah.
Okay, yeah, I thought I was doing something wrong too, but I couldn't find exactly the answer on the internet and from looking around. So that helps me out a lot. Thank you.
It is okay to use a lot of observable. Actually, as long as it's not pure component, it is okay to use observable for any other components, even if you don't actually use it. It doesn't actually add any overhead or anything. It just saves you time or it basically adds optimization for you automatically.
So have you spent any time at DiviPay? Do you guys build any custom components at all? I know you said you like to do everything on the JavaScript side, but have you had to dig in and write any native code for any specific use cases yet?
Not yet. That's coming up. So the whole Android Pay, Apple Pay, all that stuff, that's all native code. So we're coming up to the point where we're going to be writing native code. We haven't done it yet.
Do you think that's something that will come out as a module for React Native one day? Like it'll be part of the library one day? Or is that going to be something that will always have to be? Well, I'm kind of curious your opinion of this. Will there always be things that you just can't do with React Native that you need to run in and write your own native code? Or do you think that as React Native gets more mature, things like this will be available as part of the API?
I mean, as more and more features get built out, you're going to see. I think you're going to see things like. I think the map has actually even gotten there, which you're going to see more and more of it coming into React Native. The thing about Android Pay and Apple Pay, which require it to be, in native code, is just that all the APIs that you're going to call in there are all native APIs, and they're all a lot of the stuff we're doing requires special permission from Apple and Google. So Facebook's never going to be able to create actually no one's going to be able to create a module for it, just because we're going to write a module but we can't even release it because it's all under non-disclosure. So there's that side of it. So there's some things that will never be available, but I think anything that's going to be publicly available, you're going to end up either seeing it being added to the core library or being available as an npm module you can just pull down. I don't actually envision right now us writing any view handling code that's going to be dropped into native views directly. At this point, we haven't discussed anything that's going to require us to interact with a native view. That might happen. We're kind of discussing doing some graph work, and there's some really, really solid, open source graphic libraries for both Android and iOS that are going to make a lot more sense for us to use, I think, than their kind of their web counterparts. So we'll probably end up like building a module over those, but there's no reason we couldn't release that in sort of as an NPM, and then you wouldn't even need to have any native knowledge at all. You build a nice good JavaScript abstraction layer, and it'll just work.
So, have you guys looked into Code Push or any of the services similar to Code Push? And are you thinking about using something like that?
Yeah, so we want to get to the point where we're doing like a web-like continuous integration. So, every releasing updates weekly, daily, something like that. We haven't thought it completely through. We need a much more robust testing, automated testing for that to really be a viable option. And we're iterating so fast. It's we're changing things all the time. So it's writing tests is hard because it takes forever and break. But I have started to use it in the project I'm working on, my consulting job, and we're consulting almost 3 layers deep, which is kind of weird. We're working for a guy who's working for a guy who's working for a guy, right? And so getting updates pushed all the way down is hard if you have to email somebody or even getting them through like a hockey app, right? So we just put in Code Push this week, and we're looking forward to being able to push updates down without kind of invisibly. I've been impressed with the CLI on that. It just works, which is appreciated when your tools just work.
Yeah, Code Push is great, and it does just work, and it's pretty easy to like start using once you kind of get set up and understand how it all works.
I mean, yeah. So like, I think I spent probably an hour getting it up and running, and that was only because I didn't finish reading all the docs and forgot to like do that final connection where you have to code push your like parent component, right? The base of your component tree to tell it it's a code push object. And I was wondering why it wasn't working, and that was it's like, oh, then when there's a dumb so you feel really stupid. But I mean, it was really fast, so I was very impressed.
Do you think there will ever be a time where Code Push will support native modules?
Unless Apple and Google change their the way that their App Store submission process works, no, because they do a lot of verification and a lot of testing on that code to make sure it meets their guidelines, it's not malicious, and to the extent that you can do that, and there's no way for them to check those modules unless they're going through their stores. So I doubt it. I don't know what Apple and Google have up their sleeves. So it could be possible. I mean, I don't know that there's a really good technical reason why it couldn't happen, but maybe someone knows more than me. But right now on Android, when you're developing, you can actually do hot reloading in certain cases. I found that unless you're doing some very simple UI changes and stuff, it tends to leave your app in a weird state often, and you have to restart anyway. It does that with React Native too. So I don't know how reliable that would be in a production environment if you could pushing updates to Java.
That's cool though. I actually heard about the Android hot reload and wanted to play around with it, but haven't had a chance yet. So mostly like a UI thing then? You wouldn't use it for anything else really?
I haven't found it to be stable, but I haven't actually used it probably since last December. I've been out of the Android development world doing pretty much React Native since the beginning of the year. So I haven't done. I'm sure they've been making crazy improvements on it. I don't use it in my React Native development because I'm almost never changing the Java code.
Are there any modules that have been made by the open source community that you guys really rely on and use and could recommend?
Yeah, I guess our package.json is pretty big at this point. For React Native specific stuff, I'm trying to think if there's anything that we really rely heavily on. I've been using the material design, one of the material design libraries. I think it's actually React Native material design. And that's been pretty nice. Like, it's provided us a lot of like features and stuff we'd otherwise have to style ourselves. And that was, since we're doing something that's kind of very material in design, that was super convenient. But and then we have a couple other like good, some of the minor kind of little components and stuff. We wanted the tab component in one of our views to look like a material one, like on Android, but on iOS. So we ended up bringing in a tab component that ends up looking the same on both. I don't know that there's any like huge libraries that we use that are like React Native specific. Of course, I've been delighted to work with Lodash, which is great, and especially some of the cool like functional composition stuff. But yeah, I don't know, we use probably almost a dozen of these little components, which that people have just kind of donated to the community, which is kind of cool. Coming from the native realm, native mobile, there's not as much open source out there. There's some libraries that lots of people rely on. AF networking on iOS, for example. But there's less of a culture of open source, and I think part of that's just that there's a because Apple and Google provide so much for you, and you kind of do things their way, and so there's less of a need to go out and make your own tools, and so you get fewer developers do that, and then so fewer of them donate those tools to the community at large. I'm sure someone's going to get mad at me like, oh, there's all this open source stuff, and there's a lot out there, but I don't think there's anything. It doesn't even come close to it holding a candle to what's out there in JavaScript. I joke with the JS guys at Divi. I was like, yeah, JavaScript developers have ideals and mobile developers have wallets.
That's awesome. What backend are you guys using? Local backend. So are you just using async storage, or are you using something more robust?
So we haven't crossed that bridge yet. That's like on probably not this sprint, next sprint. Once we get Relay up and running, how to make that permanent is a question at the moment. I think async storage is probably not robust enough for what we need to do. But I haven't fully explored it yet. So if you guys have any suggestions on stuff that's worked for you to persist, on local data, that would be awesome. I'd love to hear those.
Yeah, I've seen React Native SQLite storage, which is kind of like they wrap the SQLite API in React Native way, so you can still using that one. I haven't used it. I only use it in some small project, but it seems pretty well. If you don't want to use the async storage, that would be a really good option.
Yeah, that, and also we had a company called Realm on our show a few months ago, and I believe they make an iOS version of their encrypted storage database, but they also make a React Native version recently. So yeah, I would check out those two for sure.
Yeah. One thing that we did do in my consulting work, we weren't actually no network layer at all. We're trying to get this like very simple kind of demo app out and getting folks use it. And so we actually we're using Firebase's database. Like they have the service where they have this like synced database. And I think they designed it mostly for the web, but we ended up using it on React Native. And there were a bit of frustrations. It didn't update quite as quickly as we wanted it to, but it more or less worked. And I was kind of out of the box because it's just JavaScript, and I was very impressed with that.
What is your strategy for staying up to date with React Native versions, since they have a cadence of every 2 weeks? And then could you talk a little bit about how you go about updating to the latest version?
Yes, I think we started at 32 when we kind of started the project, and I've been, for the time being, just moving when Facebook moves. So when I see there's an update, I just go with it. We have just released an alpha to some like very small group of users, so it hasn't really mattered that much. And I think unlike in the beginning of this year, where things were changing much more rapidly, it's become more stable. To do the upgrade itself, I just changed the number in package.json, and do an npm install. and that works for me for the most part. I found that I've had to do enough changes to the Gradle and the Xcode project files that when you go to the full upgrade process, like I think the CLI is a React Native upgrade, you know, it overwrites those files, or it tries to, and it doesn't do diffing particularly well. So, or it doesn't like actually try and intersperse its changes. It just says, "There's the diff. Do you want it? Do you not?" And I'm like, well, the answer is usually no. And so I haven't done that the last couple times. Could see that coming back to bite me, but it hasn't yet. I imagine once we have an actual product out there, be a little bit more conservative and only really change when there's a good compelling reason to do so.
So I want to switch gears for a second. It sounds like you do quite a bit of consulting, or you do some consulting. What kind of consulting do you do, and do your customers care about like what stack you use? And if they do, or if they don't, do you use React Native in some of your personal projects?
Yeah, so I've been working through some connections with basically one company, and it's me and a group of other guys who used to work with, and we sold this company on React Native. So they got burnt by some mediocre contractors when they were trying to develop their native app, and we came in and said, look, we can do this. We can give you Android and iOS in the same amount of time it took you to get one of those, and it'll be more solid and faster. And then you'll be able to take our code and pay people who are a lot cheaper to maintain it. It's kind of how we sold it.
That sounds about right, actually.
Yeah.
for most projects.
So that's, we've been working on that, and that's mostly like, I've only been consulting for a few months. That's kind of what we've been doing. But yeah, it was React Native that sold them, and they, we're working with the startup out of Silicon Valley, and they're a software firm, so they do care what their technology is made of. But yeah, it's been really good. Like we're here, with that company, with Divi, being able to sell them on React Native, and then I was talking to another company here in Salt Lake who, again, has been burned by, the amount of time and resources it takes to do native development, and kind of like this guy is, it's his little company, he's paid all this money to these consultants to build this app, and they did a decent job. It just took forever, right? And so he comes to me and he's like, I need to do like bug fixes on this Android app. And I was like, well, yeah, I can help you with that. And he's like, have you heard about React Native? He's like, yeah, I'm a React guy. That's what I do. It's like, well, it was like, and then I explained it to him, and he was like, his eyes like bugged out and his jaw dropped, and he was like, that sounds amazing. I'm like, it kind of is. And, you want to shift gears and now build your iOS app. But I'm thinking that like, if you, instead of doing that, if you re-implement, your Android app in React Native with the goal of, getting, you can still release your Android app and then develop a React Native on iOS app. And then at the end of that, you'll have something that probably pretty much runs on both platforms. And then you can maintain it because you know the paradigm. You don't know the technology exactly, but the idea of React and React components and all that, it's all the same. So you'll be able to come in and learn it very quickly, and then take it yourself, and not have to rely on the knowledge of others. So I don't know if I sold him on that, but he was very, very excited about that.
I do quite a bit of consulting as well, and I've been doing it for a while, and I haven't found anything that is easy to sell as a React Native project when I'm dealing with the mobile client. In the past, I would do Cordova development, and they would also be getting quotes from native developers. And I could never make the argument that the quality is going to be almost as good as native, because it wasn't. And it was just one of those conversations we would have, and I would be completely honest with them. But I've noticed lately, when I kind of, just go over all the things you just went into, and then also talk about how the cross-platform, app is going to be delivered when they were really only expecting either an iOS or an Android coming into the discussion. And then on top of that, my pricing comes in a lot lower than maybe they've been quoted in the past. And it's just a very easy thing to sell. And the best part about it is I have yet to have anyone that hasn't been really happy with the final product. So.
Yeah, I mean, the client I'm working with now in consulting, we released the short demo app that he took out to an event and actually had real users playing with, and he was just very happy with it and the speed at which it was developed. We did that 0 to usable in less than a month, and with one developer, just me, working part-time. And so, yeah, it's an easy sell.
So I'm curious, how do you get your clients? I know you said with this project, the big project, you were kind of already had a relationship with them, but how do you go about finding new clients as a consultant?
So fortunately, I haven't had to do too much of that yet. Basically, the guy, so this company that I've been working with, I'm working with a guy, a VC friend of a friend in Silicon Valley who keeps like a stable of engineers to rent out to his startups. So he's got more work for us than we can do in 5 years, which is nice. But then I've also talked to people like here in Salt Lake. We have a number of agencies, and I've talked to several of them and kind of been on their like backup list, I guess. So like I'm like, okay, I have these skills and this, and I don't want to come work for you full time, but you probably have projects that you end up turning down, because you just don't have the resources. But if you're missing 5-10 hours a week, then I can come in and help you with that. And so that seems to be like, had to turn down a lot of those projects because I have a full-time job in this other thing, but that has seemed to me to be pretty good pipeline for work. Rates aren't quite as good as if you're out pounding the pavement yourself, because the agency's taking their cut. But if you need work, that seemed to me to be a good way to get it.
And another thing you mentioned, as far as building for Android and iOS, this is kind of not along with what we were just talking about, but when you're building for both iOS and Android, do you kind of have both emulators open at one time and kind of develop for both as you go, or do you kind of develop for one platform and then you go back and check that same component out in the other platform and then optimize it from there, or do you kind of do them together?
I almost always work in one platform or the other to get the basic up and running. They're close enough that's usually a pretty effective strategy, and it would take too much time to constantly switch between the two, especially if you have to have an emulator up and running and the simulator up and running, and it just slows down your computer like mad. I've also done enough, I guess, native development to kind of have a feel for when things are not going to match up. So one of the other native guy that we hired who's only done iOS, he likes to develop on the emulator, and he puts out brought him in, he kind of got on to speed in React Native, and he made this thing and he's showing me the code. I'm like, oh, that's not going to work on Android. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, this isn't going to render right, and this is what it'll end up looking like. Just looking at the code, I could tell you that. And then we booted up an emulator and I showed him. He's like, whoa. And I'm like, well, it's kind of done this for enough time. You develop a kind of intuition for kind of this knowing what's going to work and what's not. But which one I work on, it really depends on what kind of frustrations I feel like dealing with on that particular day. Whether I'm up for dealing with Xcode or some of the like slowness and some of the like instability in the Android emulator, which is light years way ahead of where it was 2 years ago, but it's still sometimes kind of frustrating. So
that's interesting.
I don't know.
That's pretty cool.
Which one do you use?
Yeah, like I feel the exact same way. Like I usually will build an iOS in my iOS simulator, and then when I'm done with certain group of features, I'll go back and test them in Android. And usually it all will be fine. Keeping in mind what I've learned at this point, and taking things into consideration when I'm building, so they will not there won't be any huge issues. But yeah, I've felt the same way. But sometimes at that point, I will keep both open if I'm changing code that I think might affect one or the other. If I'm just towards the end of my design UI tweaks. But yeah, I like developing in the simulator. I feel like it's a lot faster and smoother. And then when I go into Android, it does feel a little janky. So
yeah, I mean, sometimes the thing for me that makes a difference is that React Native run iOS launches a simulator, and React Native run Android doesn't. So it's like, oh, do I feel like actually pulling an emulator up?
yeah. You gotta go through those steps. Yeah.
But I was just talking to another coworker of mine. And he's like, "Do I have to have Android Studio up to launch an emulator?" It's like, no, there's a command line for it. It's like, what is it? I don't remember. It's some crazy, like, it's emulator, but then there's like 6 different options you have to give it. And I told him to look it up, but that actually will make your life a lot easier. I found that not relying on using npm start instead of relying on the React Native run X to launch the packager, and then running those, not relying on Android Studio or Xcode to launch the emulator or the simulator, but actually doing that on the command line. It's usually faster. It requires less memory because you don't have to have the IDs, in the background, because both those guys will take up gigabytes of memory if you let them. So it's a little bit gentler on your system if you just have the emulators running on their own.
Yeah, very, very good info.
Yeah, I do actually have the similar problem a couple of months ago before they released the auto open simulator. So I actually went through the internet, and because the information about opening up the Android simulator and how you have to wait for it until it's basically being booted up, and then you need to launch your app. It's a very complex operation, and all the information is basically scattered around the internet. So what I did is I created a project. It's called React Native Nurse. If you just search, so what it does, basically, it's just a bash command, and then I basically document every single thing inside it. So if you're really interested to do that, you can just basically take a look at that one. And I documented like how to open the Android simulator, how to wait for it until it's basically boot up, because it's not similar to iOS. Because if you launch the Android, you don't even know when it's actually being loaded. So you can actually upload your app. So there is some commands that you have to basically keep pulling the simulator until it's ready. And I think they're returning an integer value between 0 to 10. It depends. It's a very complex process, but I documented everything. So if you're really interested to actually automate it, you can actually use that one.
That's actually cool. I found like getting even React developers up to speed on the native side, like the things that they're tripping over are all this hard-earned knowledge that I got from building native apps for 4 years about that side of the development environment tends to be much more difficult to get people up to speed on. They just want things to work like they worked in their web world. It's like, well, no, it's kind of ugly, and I'm sorry, but that's just the way it works. So, so it's been interesting that side of it. But I will check that out. That actually be really useful, especially being one of the hard things is getting people to like one thing. The iOS side is relatively easy, and so they develop on iOS. And then they put in a PR, and I'm like, does that work on Android? I don't think it will. And then I load it up, and it's like, look, you can't work this way. You guys got to check your stuff on Android. It's like such a pain in the butt to get the whole stack up and running. And you got to there's knowledge you got to know. Like you got to know that you should be running the x86 images, and you should be setting the settings on the emulator the right way so that you get something that will run decently fast on your system.
If someone would make a emulator that would actually run both iOS and Android while you're developing, that would be something I would pay for. If anyone's listening and wants to do that. That would be pretty amazing, especially if something like that could be built without like completely crashing my computer.
That would be very cool. One of the issues I know from us would be that we require Google Play services as part of our app, and so that will never can't like split that over Android and iOS. And then Play services is everything like Maps and cloud messaging and all that stuff. So it would be hard, but there's some really smart people running around out there, so you never know.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get to the picks. Peter, do you have any picks?
Yeah, so recently I was trying to figure out how to upload or automate the process of uploading my files to AWS when just building my JavaScript. So I came across this S3 Webpack plugin. Now, this one is not like specific to React Native, but it was pretty cool because I was able to just automate that whole process. My app would have the assets served straight from AWS right away.
Okay, great. Ali, do you have any picks today?
Yeah. A couple of days ago, I found a project. It's kind of like old. Like I guess the contributor never continued working on it, but it's kind of like a pretty interesting concept. So I think everyone knows about WebView in React Native. What he was doing was inside the tag of WebView, you start writing a regular HTML, which is a React component. So it's kind of like I don't know if I actually explain it properly. Like imagine you just basically put the WebView tag, and inside it you start writing a React component without actually passing the source of your compiled JavaScript that is basically being run. It makes it a lot easier if somebody wants to actually implement a React inside the React Native app. So it's called React Native React WebView, which is kind of like a interesting name. Check it out. The concept is pretty good. I'm planning to use it because we have some use cases, and the concept is easy and the concept is cool. So,
okay, Kevin, do you have any picks?
Yeah, I have several. So I'll try to go quick. I attended the Connect .tech conference and spoke at that in Atlanta this past weekend. I highly recommend next October to head to that conference. There were over 130 talks. There were 11 tracks, and there were 10 workshops. So it was a pretty massive kind of conference. Also want to just point out to those that may be using an older version of React Native, but our NPM is actually now a part of the React Native CLI. And I actually was using a newer version of React Native from what I'd previously been using, and I got a chance to link a component or a module, I would say. And I just wanted to make that known if you're using an older version, didn't know. And then speaking of that module I was using, React Native FS is gives native file system access for React Native, and it's helped me quite a bit on a project I'm working on, just to be able to get the path to the bundle and then to the documents directory and so forth. That's it.
Okay, I've been hearing about Connect, and I'd like to go check it out one day. So I'm glad that you went and can kind of tell us that it's awesome. Now I'm going to have to go for sure. So I have two picks. The first is a blog post that I wrote. It's a 2-part blog post. It's about how to set up the Apollo server and the Apollo client. And I kind of walked through an extremely basic example. I'm using Express and Mongo as the backend with GraphQL, and then connecting it all with React Native. And we're going to have the Apollo team on our show in a few weeks. So if you're interested in that, kind of check out my blog post or check out Apollo and listen in a couple weeks. That should be a very good discussion. My second pick is a book that I just started, so I haven't finished it yet, but so far I'm really enjoying it. It's called Getting Real. It's by the guys that created 37 Signals, and it's basically about how they built 5 profitable businesses with only 7 developers over the course of about 2 years. One of those companies being Basecamp. So it's basically about how it's about going against the conventional wisdom of going after the unicorn company to like a more conservative view of building your business instead of going for the gamble, I guess you would say, that's going to make you $1 billion. Is kind of instead take a more conservative approach and go after a business model that you know will make you money. It might not make you as much money, but it will make a lot of money. So that's at least the idea that I've gotten out of the book so far. So if you're interested in that, it's called Getting Real. It's by Jason Fried and a few other guys. Okay, Aaron, do you have any picks?
Yeah, something that I rediscovered recently. Head of engineering at EV is pushing us to like bring in some stuff that we want everyone, all the engineers at Divi to read. And so the thing that I kind of rediscovered is Joel on software. So Joel Spolsky is a developer in New York, and most of his posts are at this point 10, 15, almost 20 years old. But some really, really good wisdom on how to make good software and how to be a good software engineer. And what kind of things you need to look for in an organization you're going to join, and then how to make any organization that you're part of better at doing the job that they're there for.
Awesome. I've been wanting to read that book, so that's pretty good. Okay, cool. Well, that wraps up episode 44 of React Native Radio. Aaron, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And that wraps it up. We'll see everyone next week.